Good day. Today is the 1st of January 2023, New Year's Day, and may I take again the opportunity to wish every one of you a happy new year. I say every one of you, also your families, your friends. May 2023 be a prosperous and happy year for each and every one of you. Well, 2023 has started, and as I said, the New Year holiday is one that is celebrated all over the world, and the result is that many of this has been a relatively slow news day. Most of the politicians, at least in the Western powers, are on holiday of some form or another. Many of the financial markets are closed. It's not easy, perhaps, to get a huge amount of information about what's going on in different parts of the world, but one place where there is no New Year's holiday is the battlefields of Ukraine. There, the fighting continues at the same intensity, the same levels of intensity as always. And this morning, as I started preparing this video, I got yet more news of another Uranium-2 drone attack by the Russians on Ukraine. And there's pictures. You can sometimes you get pictures of maps of Ukraine where it tells you where the air raid alerts are, and they do seem to cover large areas of Ukraine, including Kiev, the capital. Very difficult again to get a clear view of exactly what the extent of this drone attack is, but all of this points to very heavy Russian air attacks on Ukraine starting from the 29th of December and rolling on with these air attacks continuing even as I'm making this program. By the way, it may be that I've missed it, but there wasn't as much information as there has sometimes been, certainly not in the British media, and also in other places. There's not been quite as much information and quite as much many claims made about the number of drones and cruise missiles and such that the Ukrainians say that they've managed to shot down. I'm sure that the Ukrainians have given figures, but they're not being reported as widely, and that makes me wonder whether even the Western media is now starting to become skeptical about some of these claims, especially given that it is now in fact confirmed that one of the cruise missiles that was launched on New Year's Eve actually did hit a hotel in Kiev, the Alphavita Hotel, where apparently, or at least according to the Russians, I've no way of knowing whether or not this is true, but where, according to the Russians, volunteer fighters, mercenaries if you prefer, people like that were based. Anyway, doesn't seem to be much doubt that this was a devastating attack, and as I said, these attacks are continuing. Difficult for the moment to give an overall assessment of what these attacks have achieved or perhaps done. It does seem that the Ukrainian air defense has been rather more subdued than it has been on previous occasions. One's seen fewer signs of Ukrainian missiles being launched, and of course there's less evidence of Ukrainian soldiers shooting into the air, trying to shoot down Uranium-2 drones. But again, this may simply be the result of where the pictures, where the film of these attacks has taken place. So all I will say is, to sum up, large number of Russian cruise and drone attacks, Russian cruise missile and drone offensive continuing. No sign for the moment of that offensive slackening off in any way. On the battlefields, more reports of Russian advances. There's a report this morning that a place called Klesheevka, again, I'm probably mispronouncing that name, a settlement near Bakhmut, has apparently been captured or largely captured by the troops of the Wagner organization. And incidentally, I've noticed one particular difference in the fighting in Bakhmut from the Russian side, which is that alongside the Wagner assault troops and Russian motorized infantry and militia from the Donetsk republics who have been participating in the fight from Bakhmut, there's now indications that Russian paratroopers have also joined the battle. I don't know where these paratroopers have come from, but I am going to make a guess that they are part of the force that was redeployed from the right bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region west of the Dnieper River. Most of the forces, most of the Russian troops who fought the Ukrainians west of the Dnieper River in Kherson region were airborne troops, paratroopers. And in fact, a large proportion of the Russian airborne forces was located there. And it's now, I think, widely established that a lot of senior Russian military commanders were very frustrated that these elite troops were effectively marooned west of the Dnieper River and were not being used effectively in more useful and important places. And I've no doubt that this was one of the reasons why the decision was taken to redeploy them to the east bank of the Dnieper River. And perhaps, highly probably, we're seeing some of them now being used to conduct the battle in Bakhmut. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the battlefronts. As I said, I'm sure an awful lot more is going on. All the indications are that the fighting there is at the same level of intensity as always. But the news today is thin, and that, as I said, almost certainly reflects the fact that a lot of the reporters and journalists and people who are covering the war are taking today off as a holiday. In the meantime, however, we do have one rather interesting piece of definite news, and that is that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has delivered a New Year address. Now, I should say he's not obviously the only leader to have done so. President Zelensky of Ukraine has also delivered a New Year address. I'm not going to discuss Zelensky's address because, to my mind, it was the sort of conventional address you would expect from a leader of a country, Ukraine, that is fighting a war at this time. I don't think Zelensky said anything that was particularly new or original. I've had one person suggest that it was, again, essentially a recitation of Zelensky's usual talking points and cliches. Well, that may be a bit harsh, but anyway, I don't think it was a particularly interesting address. Putin's address was different, and again, I would remind everybody that Putin has been incredibly busy over the course of December, and indeed the whole autumn. He's attended meeting after meeting with all sorts of senior officials on the military side, the civilian side. He's had important meetings with foreign leaders. He's been a very, very busy man over the last few weeks. And this New Year's address, in a sense, is a continuation of his work over the last few weeks, which is what makes it interesting. It sets out Putin's own summary of what has happened over the course of 2022, and it also, to some extent, summarizes a lot of the things that he has himself been up to over the last few weeks and months. So in that respect, it's an interesting address. It's also unusual. First of all, it's unusually long. It lasted 9 minutes. And of course, the location was different. When Putin usually gives a New Year's address, he gives it with the Kremlin, standing next to the Kremlin. And people who see Putin see the Kremlin alongside him, at least in Russia when they watch their television. This time it was different. Putin spoke from the headquarters of the Southern Military District, and he was surrounded by soldiers. And again, this was clearly an address made by a leader of a country at war. And without more ado, I'm going to go through what he said, and I'm going to read the Kremlin's readout, and I'm going to pass it, because as I said, I do think it is an interesting address and indicative of a lot of what is happening and of the way things are progressing, both in Russia and in the war in Ukraine and around the world. Anyway, the first he said, this is how Putin began. Citizens of Russia, friends, the year 2022 is drawing to a close. It was a year of difficult but necessary decisions, of important steps towards Russia's full sovereignty and a powerful consolidation of our society. Now, already in that very first sentence, there is an important point made, because he speaks about necessary decisions, and of course he's referring now to his decision to launch the special military operation. But he speaks of important steps towards Russia's full sovereignty, implying that before 2022, Russia's sovereignty, its independence, if you like, was less than full. In other words, less than complete. Well, what does he mean? What he means is that until 2022, until the sanctions war was enforced against Russia, Russia was still, to a very great extent, integrated within the Western financial and economic system. Russian banks continued to use SWIFT. Russian commercial activities were still heavily oriented towards the West. Russia imported goods from the West. It imported components for its automobile industry, its car industry. It imported aircraft. And what's now happened is that as a result of the necessary decisions, which Putin says he had to make at the start of 2022, when he signed off on the special military operation, what we now have is Russia moving away from the West. It's severed these economic links. It's building its own aircraft. It's localizing production of its car industry. There was a report, by the way, the other day by the various car producing companies which are still left in Russia, the Russian ones. They've put together a report which they've sent to the Russian government, giving a budgeted plan, putting together a budgeted plan for making all the various component parts that motor cars need in Russia itself. And it is going to be a multi-year plan. Off the top of my head, I seem to remember that the overall cost was something in the region of 300 billion rubles, which may sound like a lot, but which I would say for a country like Russia is certainly affordable. And the Russians obviously are pressing ahead with their aircraft building. They're now going to bring their MS-21 aircraft into service. They're busy producing their Tupolev 214 civil airliner. And of course, they got many more plans to build more advanced aircraft than these. And that goes along with technological changes, developments of the Russian electronics and AI industries and all kinds of things of this kind. And Putin is basically saying, well, previously, because we tried to work with the West, we were in effect tied down. That didn't give us the space to develop these own products ourselves, because it was always easier, and perhaps the pressure was also there to import these things from the West. Now we can do it, and now we are doing it. And of course, Putin doesn't just mean, he isn't just referring to economic independence. He's also referring to something else. He means that the Russians, for the first time since the last years of the Cold War, have regained independence of decision making. They're no longer constrained, as they previously were in the long years after the end of the Soviet Union, by the need always to second guess, to think what the Western powers wanted of them or would do to them if Russia didn't do what the West wanted. In other words, there's always the worry that the West would impose some sanctions somewhere, would take some steps somewhere, and that was a major constraint and limit on Russian actions. Well, the events of 2022, the economic war, about which, by the way, Putin has much to say in this address, well, all of that has again freed Russia's hands. Russia is now able to conduct its own policies as it pleases. It doesn't have to constantly check to see how the West will respond. So he has said it's a big step towards full sovereignty. Russia is once more becoming, as it was during the Soviet era, a great power, and not just a great power, but an independent power, one that is no longer tied down in the kind of globalist system that had existed, that has been created since the end of the Cold War. Anyway, there then follows the passage which Western commentators have singled out and perhaps discussed most extensively. And this is what Putin said in his next comments. It was a year that put many things in their place and drew a clear line between courage and heroism on the one hand and betrayal and cowardice on the other, showed us that there is nothing stronger than love for our near and dear, loyalty to our friends and comrades in arms, and devotion to our fatherland. Now, the view that Western commentators have given is that Putin here is drawing dividing lines between those Russians who support the special military operation, those Russians who have shown courage and heroism and loyalty to the motherland and to their friends and their comrades in arms, and those who fled abroad to avoid the draft and things of that kind, and but Putin is saying it's all or nothing. You're either with us or you're against us, and that this is a message that he's conveying to Russians. And undoubtedly there is an element of that in these words, in this sentence. However, I think it actually goes beyond that, because I think that when Putin talks about betrayal and cowardice, he's not just referencing Russians. He's also referencing the leaders of Western Europe. And I suspect he's got Hollande and Merkel particularly in mind, following their admissions about the Minsk process. And in fact, he turns to that specifically later on in his address. And then he goes on to say it was a year of truly pivotal, even fateful events. They became the frontier where we laid the foundation of our common future, our true independence. Notice again those words. So, full sovereignty, true independence. We are now once more a country that makes its own decisions. We are not tied down any longer in the web of networks and connections that tied us to the West. And then he goes on to say that is what we're fighting for today, protecting our people in our historic territories, in the new regions of the Russian Federation. Together we are building and creating. Now, this is an interesting sentence, actually, because, of course, he talks about protecting our people in our historical territories, in the new regions of the Russian Federation. But many Russians, perhaps most Russians, or at least most Russians over a certain age, will point out that yes, the new regions, by which he means the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, were indeed historical territories of Russia, but large areas of Ukraine, which are still under Ukrainian control and which fall outside those four regions, they too were previously historical territories of Russia. And of course, one can think of Odessa, one can think of Kharkiv, one can think of Zaporozhye, one can think of all sorts of other places. Some Russians, perhaps even a plurality of Russians, might even say Kiev itself. Anyway, he goes on with these words: Russia's future is what matters the most. Defending our motherland is the sacred duty we owe to our ancestors and descendants. The moral and historical truth is on our side. So this is a war of defense. It's not a war of aggression, according to Putin. It is Russia defending itself. It is Russia taking steps to ensure its security and its independence, and its independence specifically from the West. And then he goes on to say, the outgoing year has brought great and dramatic changes to our country and to the world. It was filled with uncertainty, anxiety, and worry. But our multi-ethnic nation showed great courage and dignity, as it had in every challenging period in Russian history, supported the defenders of our fatherland, our soldiers and officers, and all participants in the special military operation in both word and deed. Now note again the reference to multi-ethnic nation. Putin has repeatedly said that Russia is not an ethnicist state. It is not a state of Russian-speaking Eastern Slavs only and exclusively. It is a state of a nation made up of many ethnicities, all of which, however, consider themselves Russian. And this is a point that Putin repeatedly hammers on, and of course it is one which he would argue, and many people would argue, sets him apart from the position in Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, by contrast, this is seen as a struggle, a conflict by one nationality, which is, to be precise, the Ukrainian one. And then he goes on to say this: we have always known that Russia's sovereign, independent and secure future depends only on us, on our strength and determination, and today we have become convinced of it once again. Only on us. So yes, we've got all these friends, we've got China, India, all of these countries, Turkey, which are sympathetic and favourable to us, but ultimately our future depends on us and on us alone. If we succeed, we will have all these friends. If we fail, we will lose them. And we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that they're going to ride to our rescue. We have to do this ourselves. And now he turns to Merkel and Macron. For years, Western elites hypocritically assured us of their peaceful intentions, including to help resolve the serious conflict in Donbass. But in fact, they encouraged, and then he references an ideological movement of the 1930s in every possible way, referencing the strength of that ideological movement in Ukraine. Out of concern for the sensitivities of this platform, I'm not going to mention that ideological movement by name. You all know what I'm referring to. And then Putin goes on to say, who continue to take military and overtly terrorist action against peaceful civilians in the People's Republics of Donbass. The West lied to us about peace while preparing for aggression, and today they no longer hesitate to openly admit it and to cynically use Ukraine and its people as a means to weaken and divide Russia. We have never allowed anyone to do this, and we will not allow it now. So, quite a lot here. But of course, it references very clearly the admissions that first Angela Merkel, and now, most unwisely, by the way, the former French president François Hollande have all made, which is that the West was never really committed to the Minsk II agreement. It was intended to buy Ukraine time. That might not have been the original thinking of Merkel and Hollande when they signed off on Minsk in February 2015. But over time, and in fact very quickly, it became clear that Germany and France was not committed to the Minsk agreement because they never put the necessary pressure on the Ukrainians to implement it, and the Ukrainians have made it very clear that they had never had the slightest intention of ever implementing it. And instead, what the Germans and the French were doing was stringing the Russians along. And Putin is obviously furious about this, or at least if he's not furious, because to be frank, I doubt that he was beyond a certain point unaware of what was going on. But anyway, if he was not furious about it, he wants Russians to be furious about it. And he is going to hammer away at these admissions of Merkel and Hollande relentlessly. Now, I mentioned how Western commentators have focused very heavily on Putin's words about contrasting courage and heroism on the one side with cowardice and betrayal on the other, and how this appears to be creating dividing lines amongst Russians. And I said that there is some truth to this. But I noticed that not a single Western article or commentary that I have seen has mentioned these points that Putin is making about the way in which the West, specifically the Germans and the French, acted duplicitously towards the Russians over the Minsk agreement, and of the extraordinary collapse in confidence and trust that this has created. Now, I say that because, in fact, across the Western media overall, there's been remarkably little said about what first Merkel and Hollande have been saying on this issue. There's been obviously some things. I mean, after all, Merkel and Hollande gave their interviews to Western journals, to Western media outlets, which is where they made these admissions. But it's not been reported widely in the West that Merkel and Hollande straightforwardly admit that they were leading the Russians by the nose over Minsk, and nor is it being reported in the West what a disastrous effect this is having within Russia itself, and the extent to which Putin is emphasizing it in order to persuade Russians that the West cannot be trusted, and the extent to which this is undoubtedly gaining traction amongst Russians as well. And there has been some coverage of the fact that Putin has said that the attempts by the West to use Ukraine to weaken and divide Russia, but this has never been allowed by the Russians, and will not be allowed by the Russians. That has had some coverage, and of course what Putin is alluding to here is the well-known and widely reported within Russia itself neocon plan, fantasy plan, I would say, of dividing up Russia into its supposed component parts, which are not, by the way, differentiated in that kind of way from each other, but never mind. Anyway, Putin is alluding to that, definitely, and he is saying that this is the issue. It's an existential war for us. But of course, he's reminding Russians again that the West has been lying. It's been lying to Russia. It's played them along over Minsk. And going back to Putin's point about Russia relying on itself alone, what he is saying is we must never trust the West again. They want to weaken and divide us. When they pretend to be talking peace, they're actually merely seeking some means to prosecute their hostile policy of division against us. We will never allow that. They're using Ukraine this time to try and do it, but they will fail. And then Putin addresses directly the Russian military, and there's a long passage here. I will read it in full. Russian servicemen, militiamen, and volunteers are now fighting for their homeland, for truth and justice, for reliable guarantees of peace and Russia's security. They are all our heroes, and they're shouldering the heaviest burdens right now. From the bottom of my heart, I wish a very happy new year to every participant in the special military operation. To those who are here next to me now, and he's on television, you can see a group of them standing next to Putin, and those who are on the front line, those getting ready for action in training centres, those who are in hospitals or already back home, having fulfilled their duty, to all those now on combat duty in strategic units, and all personnel of the Russian armed forces. Comrades! Now, this is still used by Russians in a military context. They still refer to each other as comrades in a military context, even if the Soviet Union, of course, has gone. Thank you for your valiant service. Our entire vast country is proud of your fortitude, endurance, and courage. Millions of people are with you in their hearts and souls, and will be raising a toast to you at their New Year's table. Many thanks to everyone who provides ancillary support for military operations, drivers and railway workers who deliver supplies to the front, doctors, paramedics and nurses who are fighting for soldiers' lives and nursing wounded civilians. I thank the workers and engineers at our military and other plants who are working today with great dedication, builders who are erecting civilian facilities and defensive fortifications and helping to restore the destroyed cities and villages in Donbass and Novorossiya. Now, I'm going to say something here. This particular section in which Putin extends his thanks to all sorts of civilian workers who are indirectly involved in the conduct of the special military operation, has an echo of the kind of things that Joseph Stalin used to say specifically, I'm thinking of his address to Red Army soldiers from Red Square on the 7th of November 1941. And Stalin made a long list of people, he gave a whole long list of people who were made up the people of the country and who were engaged in the war. I should say this is not, when Stalin did it, completely unprecedented. If you see earlier films of the greetings that were given out by the Soviet leaders on that day, the 7th of November, they would typically give a recitation of the various people who were being congratulated on the holiday. But the most famous event of this happening was that on the 7th of November 1941. Well, we see here Putin doing something similar. And given what a profoundly historically minded country Russia is, I wonder whether perhaps, at least in Putin's own mind, he is to some extent echoing, even though he's not exactly imitating Stalin, in that famous address in the middle of the war, the darkest period of the war, the Second World War, made from Red Square on the 7th of November 1941. Anyway, we then have a slight change of tone. So when Putin talks to the military and to the people who are engaging in the military operation, he calls them comrades. Now he is talking about the economic situation. He's talking to the civilian population in Russia, those not participating in the war, who are, of course, the great majority of Russians. And he says, friends, Russia has been living under sanctions since the events in Crimea in 2014. But this year, a full-blown sanctions war has been unleashed against us. Those who started it expected our industry, finances and transport to collapse and never recover. This did not happen because together we created a reliable margin of safety. We have been taking steps and measures towards strengthening our sovereignty. Note that repeated use of that word, sovereignty, in a vitally important field in the economy. And I go back to all that I was saying at the start of the program about how the Russians have been able to adjust their economy to the sanctions and how this has actually strengthened their sense of sovereignty or independence, or at least that's how Putin wants them to think about it. And then he goes on to say, our struggle for our country, for our interests, and for our future undoubtedly serves as an inspiring example for other states in their quest for a just multipolar world order. So, the Russians aren't just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for most of the countries of the world, for China, for India, for Turkey, for the global south, because the Russians, by putting on the resistance that they're putting, and this is a speech which is all about defense and resistance, something which Westerners might find surprising, by the way, where in the West it's all been presented as the Russians being the aggressors and attackers. In Putin's language, they are the resistors and the defenders, and those that they are resisting are the West. It's the West that is using Ukraine to try and weaken and divide Russia. It is the West that lied to the Russians over the Minsk agreement and led them by the nose, even as it was preparing an aggression against Donbass. And it was the West which, in order to facilitate that aggression, supported people of a certain ideological outlook in Ukraine itself and help those people arm themselves and build up the forces which Ukraine was going to use to carry out this aggression that Putin is talking about. So it's interesting to see the very different perspective which Putin is giving to these events. And I'm going to say straight away that whatever people in the West may think about this, I think that Putin deep down is sincere. I think he does believe at a very real level, a very deep level, that he is indeed leading a resistance to the hegemonic policies of the West and of the United States specifically, and that by carrying out this resistance, he is laying the foundations not just of Russia's own full independence and sovereignty, but for the multipolar world that he and Russia are fighting for and which he is confident is to come. So this is quite quite heady stuff, but this is the part of the speech which is addressed to the world. It's also addressed to Russians because it says, yes, we're fighting for ourselves. We are defending our own homeland. We're defending our own country. We're defending our own independence. But through that very act of resistance, we are to some extent helping others liberate themselves. We are providing the means for the liberation of other nations, not perhaps by engaging in continuous war, but through our example, if nothing else. And here again, by the way, and in passing, I think that there is some kind of echo, perhaps intended, perhaps not, perhaps even subconscious, with Stalin's speech to the Red Army soldiers on Red Square on the 7th of November 1941, because over the course of that speech, Stalin also said to those soldiers that they're not just fighting for Russia, for the Soviet Union, for a war of defense, but that they are also fighting a war of liberation for the people of Europe who are under the yoke of the power that had gained, that had achieved domination of Europe and which was based in Berlin. So there are these echoes. Could simply be, as I said, that given how hardwired memories of the war are amongst Russians, Putin is just making these allusions, these echoes subconsciously. But I have to say, I think that is unlikely myself. I think he is using these sorts of words and making these kind of comments because he knows that amongst Russians, they have traction. And then he goes on to say, I consider it very important that in the outgoing year, such qualities as mercy, solidarity, and proactive empathy have become especially important in Russia. More and more Russians feel the need to help others. They rally together and take initiative without any formal instructions. Now, the last is actually true. And one of the things that's happened over the course of this special military operation, and something that again doesn't get much coverage in the West, is that all kinds of voluntary associations have appeared in order to try to assist the soldiers on the fighting front. Now, there's also, it must be said, some organizations or voluntary associations which have appeared which probably are opposed to the war, but they don't seem to be very many of those, and they are far outnumbered, as far as I can tell, by these voluntary associations and groups of citizens that have come together to do what they can to help the soldiers. And this is a curious but undoubted further development of Russian civil society, which, by the way, has been developing rapidly ever since the Soviet collapse, and had even begun to stir before. And that is quite an important development in itself, and one which will change the political culture in Russia eventually. Though, as I said, it's still, also it seems to me, very much a work in progress. Anyway, it's interesting that Putin is aware of it and that he acknowledges its existence. And he goes on to say, I want to thank you for being so considerate, responsible, and kind, for your active involvement in the common cause, regardless of age or income. You arrange warehouses and transport to deliver parcels to our fighters in the combat zone, to the residents of affected cities and towns, and help organize holidays for children from the new constituent entities of the Federation. My friends, you are providing great support to the families of the fighters who perished, who gave their lives defending the lives of others. I know how difficult it is for their wives, sons and daughters, and for their parents who raised real heroes. I understand how they feel. on New Year's Eve, we will make every effort to help the families of our former fallen comrades raise their children, give them a good education, and get a profession. With all my heart, I share your pain and ask you to accept my sincere words of support. So here we have Putin following up on his meeting with the mothers of the soldiers who had died in battle. And once again, he's in a New Year's address, acknowledging their sacrifice and their sorrow, and he's promising them help. Now, I have to say this again, I've discussed continuities in this speech. This is perhaps one point where, instead of a continuity, we have an important point of just departure. If you go back and read the speeches that Soviet leaders made during the Second World War and in the various conflicts the Soviet Union was involved in afterwards, you will not find words like this. You won't find very much acknowledgement from those leaders of losses or of the hurt suffered by the families, and specifically the parents of soldiers who died in battle. It's not to say that there was indifference previously about these kind of things. On the contrary, if you watch Russian films and are familiar with Russian history, you will know that there was a great deal of concern and interest about this kind of thing in Russia. It was not, however, typical, especially during a war, for the leader of the country to talk in this way about soldiers who have died in battle and about the loss suffered by their families. And on this occasion, Putin, as I said, is sounding much more like a leader of a more, shall we say, democratic society. He has to address the fact that there have been sacrifices, that people have suffered losses. He has to acknowledge it, and he has to make it clear to them that he shares it. And again, this is a further sign, to my way of thinking, of how Russia is changing, of how it is evolving, and how in a curious way this war is helping it to evolve in certain directions, which again are different and which might surprise Westerners. Most Western discussions about the effect of the war on Russia talk about the restrictions and clampdowns that the Russian authorities have been imposing on members of the anti-war movement and criticism of the war. And there has indeed been some of that, quite a lot of that. But alongside that, there are these other trends which you could talk about: democratization, further engagement with civil society, further acknowledgement of the role civil society is playing within Russian society, and a humane acknowledgement of the losses that some Russians are suffering as a result of this war. For the record, I can't recall a single speech of Stalin's or of Brezhnev's during the Afghan wars, or indeed of any Soviet leader, which spoke about losses of people in this kind of way. And then he ends the speech with these words. Friends, our country has always celebrated the start of the new year, even during very difficult times. It has always been everyone's favorite holiday and has a magical power to reveal the best in people, to heighten the importance of traditional family values. Yet another reminder of the difference between Russia today and the West, because of course Putin has been saying now in a number of speeches that in the West they don't value traditional family values anymore. And he inserts into these words in his New Year's address that New Year celebrations heighten the importance of those traditional family values. And he talks about the energy of kindness, generosity, and trust. This is an important issue because I think this is becoming an important dividing line. But I'm not going to discuss it in more depth in this program. I think, again, most of you can work out what it all means. And then he finishes along these sort of lines. As we see the new year in, everyone strives to give joy to their loved ones, to show them attention and warmth, to give them presents they have been dreaming of, to see the delight in children's eyes and parents' touching gratitude for our attention. The older generation knows how to appreciate such moments of happiness. Friends, now is the best moment to leave all personal grievances and misunderstandings in the past, to tell our nearest and dearest how we feel, how much we love them, how important it is to take care of each other always at any time. Let these heartfelt words and noble feelings give each of us immense strength and confidence that together we will overcome all challenges and keep our country great and independent. Great. First acknowledgement of Russia becoming a great power. Not something that Russian leaders have particularly wanted to emphasize very much since the Soviet Union fell. But here we see Putin referring to Russia as a country that has to be kept great and independent. And then he finishes, we will only move forward to fight for our families and for Russia, for the future of our only beloved motherland. Again, Happy New Year, friends. Happy 2023. The future of our only beloved motherland. And again, that's something of a swipe, perhaps, to people of an intellectual point of view, people who might perhaps see themselves as citizens of the world. He says to most Russians, in fact, we have only one motherland, and that is Russia. So, an interesting address, more sophisticated and complex than it first appears. One, as I said, which in some ways I think does probably intentionally echo things that have been said previously by previous Russian leaders at a time when Russia was at war, and one which acknowledges certain important developments within Russia itself, the growth of civil society there, the fact that there is a democratization underway within Russian society, alongside, as I said, the clampdowns on anti-war sentiment and that kind of thing. But there is also a further democratization underway as well, and that a leader like Putin cannot afford to do what previous leaders of Russia once did, which is simply ignore people who suffered personal losses. He has to acknowledge them. He has to tell them that he sincerely cares for them and that he sincerely cares for the losses that they have suffered. And at the same time, the overarching points that he hammers away, that this is a war for Russia's existence, obviously, because the Western powers are out to divide Russia. They're using Ukraine to do it. They're untrustworthy. They lie. They've been lying to Russia. They lied over the Minsk agreement, and there's no reason to think that they've changed. So we have to defend ourselves. But by defending ourselves, we're discovering our own strength. We're discovering how strong and resilient our economy was, despite all the pressures that have been put on it through the sanctions war. And by doing that, we are securing our full independence, our ability to make our own decisions, and by extension, to decide for ourselves what kind of country and what kind of society we are going to be. In other words, we're not going to be constantly looking over our shoulder at the West. We're not going to be treated as a pupil, the naughty pupil in the school, ticked off by the teacher all the time, be it that teacher, the European Union, the Americans, or whoever. We are going to be a country fully, truly independent, fully and truly sovereign, and we're going to achieve that ourselves, because we can only ultimately rely on ourselves alone. But by doing that, we are in effect waging a war of liberation, not just for ourselves, but for the world generally. We're offering an example of how resistance against Western pressure can succeed. So, as I said, an interesting speech, and one which perhaps most Russians, well, they won't decode it with the degree, to the extent that I have done. They won't parse it as carefully as I have done. But a lot of what Putin says, as I said, is hardwired amongst Russians already. I mean, most Russians, certainly Russians over a certain age, are familiar with the wartime speeches, for example. And they will, even if they don't quite notice the overt echoes that Putin is making to some of those speeches, they will nonetheless have a kind of rhyme which Russians will recognize. And at the same time, it's likely that Russians, again, they may not particularly notice comments, references to traditional values and family values and things of this kind. But once more, it probably does have a certain, it does have a certain rhythmic quality to which most Russians will respond. So a clever speech, kind that Putin makes, as I said, quite often, it's more complex and denser than perhaps many people in the West understand. And it does again give a sense of how Putin, at least, and I suspect the Russian leadership, see the war. They see it as an existential conflict from the Russian point of view. They see it as a conflict that Russia must win, but they are convinced that they will win, that they have the resources to win, and they also believe that once they have won this war, they will have achieved great things. They will have established their own independence, they will have made themselves masters of their own house, and they will have shaken Western hegemony, the unipolar system, the globalist system, if you prefer, to its core. Now, as I've passed the speech, perhaps I should say that again, there's been the usual long Western commentaries about the progress of the war. And I've now noticed that a particular theme that's starting to appear is that as a certain grudging understanding comes to the fore that Ukraine cannot win this war, it doesn't have the means to do so. Some kind of the best that the West can hope for is some kind of a stalemate. So the Institute for the Study of War is once again trotting out the theme about the Russians having been, going to run out of ammunition at some point. Who knows? Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. I very much doubt it myself. And there is a sense, I think, that some great stalemate is perhaps coming, and that there is no military solution to this war. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has written another interesting piece for 1945 magazine, in which he says that Ukraine has no path to victory. It's certainly my view I absolutely share. He's also, by the way, modified, I noticed, very significantly some of his expectations of what the Russians might do. He no longer seems to think that the Russians are going to launch grand strategic offensives. He seems to think that instead they're going to pursue the grinding war that we have seen. But anyway, putting all that aside, there is now this view that there's going to be a long war. Well, that is undoubtedly the case. But there is now the new theme, if you like, is that Ukraine is successfully defending itself and that there is no military solution to this war. It will all have to end in some kind of negotiation at which the Russians will be at some sort of a disadvantage. Well, I'm going to say straight away that I have heard this all before. I remember during the war in the Caucasus, people in the West were saying exactly the same thing throughout the 2000s, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. There was endless articles saying that the Russians would never succeed in pacifying the Caucasus, that there was no military solution to the war in the Caucasus, that sooner or later the Russians would have to compromise, and a compromise in a way that, in effect, recognized the secession of some of these Caucasian regions, North Caucasian regions, with all the enormous consequences for the Russians that involved. Well, there was a long war. The Russians did, however, eventually win. And I think the same will happen in Ukraine. I don't think, moreover, that it's going to take anything like as long. But I just wanted to say that because if you've been reading those kind of articles over the New Year holiday, as I have been, well, just bear that in mind. This is not the first time that has been said, and Putin's own words in the speech that he has just delivered suggest that he at least is confident of eventual victory. The Russian Ministry of Defense has also, by the way, published New Year's greetings to Russian soldiers, and it too speaks of victory, and I think that is the Russian aim. Anyway, that's me for the day. That's all I'm going to say on this program, except again to wish you all a very happy new year. I hope you found this a useful breakdown of Putin's New Year address. And it only remains for me to remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, as well as YouTube, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Rockfin, Telegram, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, that you can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.